Right. Okay, well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to talk about arachnid macro photography. It's a huge subject to try and cover in such a short space of time. So I've put together a bit of an intro to macro. I've picked out a varied selection of images to look at, and hopefully I can provide some insight into my thought processes as a macro photographer, and offer some advice and tips that might be helpful if you're looking to get into macro photography, or perhaps you're already photographing arachnids and are looking to improve. I'm based in Wakefield, West Yorkshire, and all of the images I was sharing today were taken in and around the local area. Generally, people don't realise what an incredible variety of arachnids can be found even in Wakefield. And generally, well, take this harvestman, for example, Megabunus diadema, with its amazing crowned ocularium. When I post pictures of these to social media, people from all over the world comment on its beauty, yet very few people here even know they exist. So through macro photography, my goal is to showcase local biodiversity, to raise awareness of the tiny worlds playing out all around us, and hopefully to drive the sort of engagement that will encourage others to look out for nature in the future. Macro photography means different things to different people, and different photographers have their own styles and approaches. But I'd split my photography into two distinct styles. The first being a style that I refer to as pictorial, so more creative. When you're wanting to produce something visually appealing, maybe something that would look good hung on a wall or in a magazine, something that has impact. For this downy jumping spider, Arachnids pubescens, held a piece of coloured card to create a background. I've used a really low angle, in fact shooting from below the level of the spider. I've punched up the colours, I've added some sharpening and so on. The second style is what I call applied photography, where the image should be a true representation of the subject that captures features or behaviours that are true to life in nature. And this kind of image might appear in something like a field guide or an encyclopedia to illustrate a species. And that doesn't mean you can't create a nice image, but it helps to be able to clearly see the main features of the subject. Colours need to be accurate. You can't add or remove bits from the subject, which might sound obvious, but maybe you're tidying up dust spots or creating a focus stack or doing some kind of work on the image. It can be very easy to accidentally add or remove identifying features like spines. Just as a side note, if you're hoping to get an ID from a photograph, it's always helpful to carry a little ruler in your bag. Unlikely anyone will mistake this Atipus affinis, but sometimes a close-up macro shot can be deceptive and scale can be hard to judge. I've talked about ID, but why am I as a photographer so keen to get an ID of a spider to species? Does it really matter? Well, first of all, because I understand the importance of spider recording, that it helps you guys, the experts, to better understand what's happening with the populations of our spiders. And secondly, I just like lists. It's nice to be able to file all the species together and keep a record of what I've found. And I've tried to keep an up-to-date list on the website where I've got species pages for spiders, harvestmen and the like. But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, because getting an ID is that first step towards learning about your subject, its special characteristics, physical features, behaviours. I'm a great believer that the more you understand about the subject you're photographing, the better your images will ultimately be. It enables you to look out for specific things and to plan your shot and capture that important detail, leaving it less down to chance. Some of my favourite macro photographers actually come from not a photography background, but they're entomologists or experts in their field. And it also means that you can describe your images and talk about them in an interesting way. Personally, I think my talks would be pretty boring if I described every image as, here's a 42 image stack of a spider shot at 200th of a second f2.8. because that's not the story that I'm trying to tell. So in simple terms, macro photography is about taking photographs of small things and seeing them back on the big screen or in print. Unless you happen to live in Australia, arachnids are generally very small, maybe just a few millimeters or less. So the first challenge when photographing them is having enough magnification. Here we've got a female Euphrates frontalis, maybe 3-4 millimeters in size, very small. So to get a shot required a lot of magnification. And the amount of magnification you can achieve depends mainly on the lens that you're using. But what actually do we mean by magnification and how do we measure it? The Wikipedia definition for macro photography is a photograph in which the size of the subject on the image sensor is life size or greater. So to illustrate what this means, I've taken a photograph of a 1p piece, but 1:1 or 1 times magnification. The red and blue measurements represent the size of the sensor in my camera. And the sensor is the thing that detects light coming through the lens from which the final image is created. I use a Nikon Z6, it has what we call a full frame sensor. And that refers to the size of the sensor, which is 36 millimeters by 24 millimeters. So at 1:1 magnification, the maths is simple. An object 36 millimeters wide would fill the frame in our image. If you use a crop or micro 4/3 camera, which have smaller sensor sizes, the 1p piece is going to fill more of the frame. Notice the date of this coin, 1976, which is even older than me. And I draw your attention to that because the date on this coin is about 3 millimeters long. So imagine the jumping spider we saw previously, and look how small it would be in the frame at this magnification. My go-to lens is the Laowa 100mm, which has up to 2 times magnification. And this is what our 1p looks like at 2 times magnification. An object 18 millimeters would fill the frame. So our 20mm coin no longer fits in the image. When I started photographing arachnids, I quickly realized that I needed more magnification. So I purchased another Laowa lens, the 25mm, 2.5 times to 5 times magnification lens. And at 5 times magnification, an object roughly 7 millimeters would fill the frame. And our 3mm jumping spider is starting to look a little bit more respectable. So here's my setup. As I say, it's a Nikon Z6 mirrorless camera. I've got on there the 100mm Laowa lens. I'm going to talk a little bit about lighting in a bit, but I always have a little speed light on top. And that big black and white thing in front of that is a diffuser, which again I'm going to talk about shortly. So I have managed to get up to 10 times magnification, which an object about 3.6 millimeters would fill the frame here. And you can see that the depth of field is now minuscule, so less than the depth of the number on the coin, which if you have a 1p handy, have a look and see how small that actually is. But this level of magnification isn't for the faint of heart. Generally, the more magnification you add, the smaller the working distance becomes, the less light you have available, the shallower the depth of field is, and movement becomes more amplified. It just gets harder and harder. So my recommendation would be to start towards the 1:1 magnification end, keep practicing, refining your technique, and as you get more confident, try 2 times or 5 times or wherever you want to take it. And this is the kind of result I can get at 10 times magnification. It's a recently hatched live Clubiona spiderling, maybe just a millimeter or so. So it's amazing to be able to see such a thing in such detail. So this is how I'm getting 10 times magnification. It's a DIY lens using a microscope objective and some extension tubes. And the whole thing only costs a few quid, and it works surprisingly well. But macro photography isn't just about getting as close to your subject as possible. Think about what it is that you want to show. What's the story that you're trying to tell? I like to photograph subjects in situ in their natural environment. So step back and include some of that environment in your shot. When I started out in photography maybe 8 years ago, I joined the local camera club, and I was entering images into competition and receiving feedback from judges about composition. So think about what the focus of your image is. Is that the sharpest part of your image? Are there any distractions in the image, things that lead your eye away from the subject? Can you include elements that lead your eye to the subject, like lead-in lines, for instance? Think about where the subject is positioned in the frame. Use the rule of thirds, that kind of thing. And as you improve as a photographer, you can start to make these kind of decisions in camera when you're taking the shot. I do photography to get away from the computer screen, so less time spent processing the image, the better. So I wanted to talk about lighting, and I've dug this image out from the archives. This was taken a few years ago when I first started doing macro photography. And it's quite an interesting subject, Coletes atropos, with some spiderlings there that she's protecting. But the lighting is pretty horrendous. So you can see spiders tend to be quite shiny subjects. And if you have light that's too harsh, so maybe it's from a direct flash or just strong sunlight, you get these very bright white highlights that really take away a lot of the detail in the image. So this is a more recent shot of same species of spider, and this one is taken with a diffuser that you saw in the setup shot earlier, which is a Cygnus Tech diffuser, and that diffuser really does sort out those strong highlights. So you've still got some highlights, but they're now very soft. And it also allows you to kind of fill in some of the shadows and give you a lot more detail in the darker areas around features such as the eyes, which can be important when you're trying to identify a spider. When shooting close up, depth of field becomes very thin, and you can use that to your advantage. So you don't have to try and get everything in the image sharp. I quite like to get kind of foreground and background elements to be blurred, kind of ensuring that the main parts of the spider are in focus, but using depth of field a little bit creatively to create a nice image. Now, if you're not able to get enough depth of field in your shot from the lens that you're using or the lighting conditions or whatever, there's a technique that you can use called focus stacking, which is when you take a series of shots at different focuses, so focusing on different parts of the spider, and you then stitch them together to create an image where everything that you want to be in focus is in focus. So I've created a very simple example of this Amrobius ferox, a male with these very impressive pedipalps on display. And I'm not sure how good the feed is on your end, but you should be able to see that here the pedipalps are nicely in focus, but the eyes here are a little bit blurred. So I've taken a second shot, and in this second shot we've got the eyes which are nicely in focus, but now the pedipalps are blurred. So what I've done is I've combined those two images together to give a final image where both the eyes and the pedipalps are nicely in focus. So it's a very simple 2-image stack. It gets a lot more complicated. So if you want to create a stack where you're filling in all of the focal points, all of the areas of the spider from the front to the back, you want it all to be sharp, you have to use a large number of images in your stack. And there's a lot of software that can help you to achieve that stack. So I use Photoshop, and it's simply a case of loading all of the layers as an image into Photoshop, aligning them up. So there's an auto align feature in Photoshop, and then there's a blend function which just creates the stack for you. So it does all the work for you. There's other software out there as well that can do the same job. What I tend to find is that the software can be very hit and miss, and it struggles particularly on features like fine hairs, or areas where you've got elements in the background that are sharp and you don't want them to be, you want them to be blurred. So as you improve at doing focus stacking, it's worth learning how to kind of manually focus stack your images, and that's why I like to use Photoshop to do that. So I'm a big fan in photographing behaviours in nature. I think it adds a lot more to the shot than just a straight record shot of the subject. So behaviours such as here, we've got a Falcus spider with an egg sac, which I actually took this shot earlier in the week. In fact, she's sitting behind me in the corner of this room right now. So I'll be watching out for those hatching and seeing if I can get a follow-up shot of that at some point, maybe next week. And mating behaviours are always fascinating in arachnids, and there are a lot of different stories to tell around mating behaviours across different species. So here we've got a Pisora male, which I spotted walking around carrying this little package, which is a neatly wrapped up nuptial gift. So he's going to offer that to a female to try and initiate mating with her. Mating displays, always fascinating to watch and very difficult to photograph because subjects, particularly these male Euphrys frontalis, who they do these spectacular dances, but they really don't stay still, and their arms and legs are moving extremely quickly. So just a single shot, just to try and capture that, and it does kind of demonstrate a little bit of a movement that was going on at the time. But then we've got the actual mating shots, so trying to get in and watch spiders mating. So I was very fortunate to find these mating Nigma in the garden last year. I actually managed to observe the whole process from start to finish. So the male approaching the female and engaging, and it took them about half an hour the process lasted for. And that allowed me to, first of all, get some good video footage of the process, but also be able to get in and capture some of the details of what we're going on. This was another pair of mating Nigma from last year. On this occasion, the female was extremely large, so very gravid. When I came back to photograph them, after getting this shot, the male had disappeared, and all that was left, there was a trail of silk, which I followed to where the female had relocated near the front door of the house. And I was able to then track her progress over the following weeks, where she created a little silk web and laid some eggs, which remained there for about 8 months. So every day for 8 months, I was leaving the house and checking on the status to see if anything had hatched. And eventually we got some little Nigma spiderlings. A lot of wolf spiders wandering around at the moment with egg sacs. I've got plenty of photographs of them either with egg sacs or with their spiderlings on their back. I particularly like this shot because it's kind of the moment in between that where you've got the spiderlings climbing out onto the mum's back, So you've got a shot there. You've got the egg saccing shot. You can see some spiderlings still inside there, and showing the spiderlings on the moon's back. And it always pays to get down to the level of the spider. So you can imagine I spend a lot of time crawling around on the floor, even when they've got spiderlings on the back. These things move at a fair pace. Also look out for spider habitats and homes. It's always worth getting shots of interesting webs. So this one's Cyclonica cosa, which creates this really neat stabilimentum, I think it's called, that runs through the middle of the web. Something I tried a couple of weeks ago. So I was fortunate enough to spend the day out with Dr. Oxford and Richard Wilson. We did a bit of spider recording up at Brockerdale. About 5 hours before we were due to meet, I headed up there and tried to do a little bit of early morning macro photography, and I managed to get some great shots of spiders on their webs covered in dewdrop. Another time of day that I love to go out photographing arachnids is after the sun's gone down, when it's dark, and I love heading off out into the woods, seeing what I can find. And it's always extremely busy, and all the nocturnal arachnids are out in force, particularly in the this kind of autumn, early winter months when the harvestmen are out in force. And it's great to be able to watch those guys going about their business. One thing that I spent ages trying to find was a pair of mating harvestmen. So this was 2021. I got this shot towards the end of the harvestman season. I've been spent all season trying to find some mating harvestmen. I found this mating pair, or so I thought. Once I got down on my knees and got close to them, it turned out that it was actually a pair of females that were locked together and fighting over a piece of food. So I had to wait a whole year till the next harvestman season, until eventually I managed to find this pair of mating harvestmen, which was quite a brief encounter. They tend not to like the light shining on them, so when you're photographing at night, you need to try and be able to see the subject. So I just hold a little head torch just to illuminate them while I can get the shot, and that kind of put them off a little bit, and yeah, they finished and moved on. I've also been fortunate enough to find harvestmen ovipositing eggs. So these are the kind of things that I'm looking out for in my photography, kind of little behaviours and interesting things that you don't often see, and certainly you wouldn't see this kind of thing, I don't think, with the naked eye. I do a lot of mite photography, which I'm not really going to talk much about mites today, but yeah, it's nice to be able to see, for instance, mites such as this slug mite, which is a parasitic mite, and extremely small. So be able to see these up close is great. But it's not just mites that do the parasiting. Sometimes they fall victim. Something that I see quite regularly actually is spiders with some kind of parasitic larva attached. And on this occasion, I thought, why don't I keep the spider and we'll see what happens next. So this was a couple of weeks later, with the Clubionis spider here, almost being dwarfed now by the larva, which is massively grown in size. And at this point, the spider was actually still moving around fairly well, starting to slow down a little bit. But eventually, the larva had used the spider to its purpose and decided to kill it and then consume it and move on to its next phase, which was creating a little silk sac. And I managed to document the process of the larva developing through, from creating, you can see it starting to develop little legs and antennae. You can see now we've got some eyes starting to form. We've got some meconium at the base there. But then eventually it started to resemble an actual wasp. And at this point, it was moving about quite freely in there for a few days. But eventually, we had this amazing, beautiful wasp emerged, which I then released to go and terrorize some more spiders. With that, I'll leave a screen to say thank you. Thank you for letting me talk today, but also thank you to everyone who's helped me with IDs over the last couple of years and helped me to learn and to better understand arachnids and be able to talk about them in the way that I do. So, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Tim. That was brilliant. Some amazing shots there. Have we any questions, please?
Yes, I have a question. You said you used a microscope lens for part of your macro setup. Can you tell me what magnification lens that is? I have a macro setup, but it's a normal camera lens, and a microscope lens would be quite useful to me, I think.
Yeah, so it's a 10 times microscope objective. So I can probably send you some details afterwards, but the key thing with it is getting the distance of the objective, the right distance for that particular objective. I think it says on the objective how far it needs to be from the sensor, in the same way that it would with if you're using it with a microscope. So what I needed to do was use some adaptation rings and some extension tubes. So an adaptation ring to adapt the microscope objective to the extension tubes, and then another adaptation ring to adapt the extension tube to the camera.
Yes.
So yeah, a little bit tricky to kind of work out which components you need, but surprisingly it works very well. Very difficult to use out in the field, handheld. But very useful for getting kind of close-up shots of features of spiders. I do a lot of, as I say, mite shots, which are incredibly small and good to be able to get that magnification.
You always use it handheld rather than on any support, and do you have any difficulties with shutter speeds if you're doing that?
I always shoot handheld. I find particularly with arachnids, they very rarely keep still. So I mean, you might find an arachnid on a web, for instance, which you might be able to set up a shot using a tripod or something in that case, but generally they tend to move around a lot and you're chasing them around the undergrowth and that kind of thing. So I prefer to have the flexibility to be able to handhold. In terms of shutter speed, so I'm using a flash. And that means that I can usually set a shutter speed at about maybe 160th, 200th of a second.
Okay,
and the flash then kind of takes care of the extra lighting that I need.
Yes, and I have one further question. I'm sorry to monopolize you. When you're stacking, do you use the automatic facility of your camera to take a series of photographs, or do you take individual photographs, altering the focus as you go along?
Yeah, so the lens that I've talked about there, the Lauer lenses, so they are manual focus lenses. So because of that, I'm not able to use the in-camera focus stacking. So I do everything manually.
Yes.
Which, so it's a case of focusing on a particular part, usually the front of the spider, and then just taking a series of manual shots, one after another, moving kind of through the focus range. And in terms of stacking that in software, so I then load that from the camera. I'll usually process them in Lightroom, so sort out the lighting, the white balance, that kind of thing. So kind of make some minor adjustments in that respect, apply them to all the images, load them as layers into Photoshop, and then use the inbuilt focus stacking in Photoshop to do the actual stacking.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much indeed, and a very, very informative talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just say that I've experimented with ×10 objectives, and I find that for a standard objective, the working distance is incredibly small. You can get ×10 objectives which have got a working distance of about 15 millimeters or more. They're quite expensive. I'm amazed if you've been using one with a working distance of about 2 or 3 millimeters, you've managed to get anything at all. So,
yeah,
is yours with that sort of working distance?
yeah. I mean, I really, I kind of did it as more of an experiment than something that I would actually use out in the field. And I was actually quite surprised how well it worked. But because of that, I decided to go for the cheapest objective I could get. It cost me £8 off of Amazon. So I suspect it's not the best quality, and as you say, you can probably use better ones. But yeah, the working distance is very small, as you say, a few millimeters. I also purchased a 40 times magnification objective to see how that would work. And at 40 times magnification, the working distance is 0 millimeters. It has to be physically touching the subject in order to get a shot. So yeah, not really very practical at all.
Excellent.
Any further questions?
Me.
Yep.
So
Well,
more comments than questions, Tim, because you're miles beyond me. You can see why I wanted my talk to be first, because if yours had been first, it would have been all downhill. So, but I just wanted to say that, particularly as somebody who sees, your tweets firsthand a lot, because I'm part of the team manning the BS Twitter feed, I think what you do just goes so far beyond brilliant photography. And for us as arachnologists, the insights that you give into the lives of the arachnids you photograph are just fantastic. I just think it's a, it is a whole new world, it is a different world. And there are things that we read about, but we don't have the opportunity to see. So this is just a big sort of vote of huge appreciation for what you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. And you've got nothing to worry about, by the way. Your talk was absolutely brilliant, and I loved it too.
Thanks.